So, welcome back everyone. In this week in macroeconomics, just to remind you that we began to realize that what we had learned in microeconomics, while very useful, applied to a single market. And our problem was what happens when we take all these markets and put them together. And the problem we faced is that once we integrate multiple markets together, then we face the issue of market interaction. And then we have to think about what happens not in one market, but in all markets put together. So with that in mind, our first aim was to figure out a way to make some measures that would be useful for us to do an analysis of the economy, because the ways in which we've looked at markets individually are not enough so far. Right? So the measures we're going to look at now are mainly focused on the national economy. Over time, particularly if you come to upper division classes and you take classes on international political economy with me or my colleague, Professor Danby, you're going to learn to integrate questions of balance of payments, trade, exchange rates, things like that into the picture. But for now, let's just focus on a national economy. There'll be little places where you can see the international come in even at this stage, but we're not going to do a full-on analysis of that. And so we're going to focus on three major measures. The first is going to be a measure of economic activity in terms of production levels. The second is going to be a measure of price levels. And the third is going to be a measure of unemployment. All right, so three measures. So let us start with the first measure. The first measure is something most of you have heard us, probably seen in the news, probably come across before. It's called the gross domestic product, or the GDP. Usually when people talk about the level of economic activity and they say the economy is doing well, not well, the economy is growing, we're having a boom, we're having a recession, this is what they're referring to, the GDP. Usually we measure, particularly recessions, we measure growth all through the GDP. So what is this? So the GDP is called the gross domestic product, is one of a series of measures. GDP is just one of them, and we're going to go through all of them, which help us think about production. In the United States, historically, the GDP has been an anchor for this NEPA, which is the National Income and Product Accounts. And it is also an anchor for the SNA, or the System of National Accounts. The SNA is a United Nations effort to create a system of accounting that's used by all countries. And so there's actually work right now in the US, so the NEPA is pretty closely aligned with the SNA. And that's what allows us to make sure that we can compare countries. Because if everybody's using their own measurement and nobody's following the same system, you can't compare, right? So national income and product accounts is what is usually the terminology used within parts of the United States. This is aligned with SNA, which is the Global Terminology System of National Accounts, which is what you get from the United Nations. But essentially, both of these systems are systems that seek to measure the level of output in the economy. So you remember that you did the production possibilities frontier way back when? In the PPF, we measured total output. And you were focused on, should I produce A or should I produce B? You were focused on two different markets. But what happens if I think about all markets put together? So my system of accounts is thinking more about what is the total volume of production in this economy. So the GDP is defined as the total value or the sum of, every element of this is important, all newly produced, final goods and services produced inside the borders of a country. So GDP is usually measured in relation to national boundaries. So the first thing to remember is that what I'm focused on is what is physically produced as a good or a service within the boundaries of my country. So let's go through every element of this. The GDP seeks to measure the total volume of production over a specific period of time. So it's going to be something that we're going to call a flow. I'll talk about stocks and flows in a little bit. All right. So what I do is I say, okay, in the past year, 2020, starting from Jan 1, 2020 to December 31, 2020, let me look at what my production was. And I'm going to look at all newly produced, stuff that I produced in that year, newly produced. So second-hand cars are not part of GDP because they counted the year they were produced. If you count them this year, you counted them when they were produced, you're counting them again, you're counting them more than once, you don't actually have new stuff. Newly produced. Final. By final, I mean goods and services that have reached a particular stage of completion in relation to their destination. So final here is, for example, if I'm going to count a t-shirt, I'm not going to count the textile that went into the t-shirt, right? Because if I counted the textile and I then counted the t-shirt, I'm counting the textile twice because the value of the t-shirt already includes the cost of the textile, right? So outputs already include input costs, and so therefore I'm going to look at final. I'm not going to look at intermediate goods and services, right? Newly produced, only this year, no second-hand stuff. Final, intermediate goods are already included in the cost of final goods, so I'm not going to re-include them. Right? Goods and services, because I can use my resources to produce physical goods, but you know, things like medical services, education, teaching, where I'm using my resources are also part of your production inside the borders of the country. What I'm focused on is if the production takes place inside the country. So for example, if there's a foreign corporation that's got a subcontract and they're producing cars here, it counts for us. It's our production. We're not looking right now at ownership or citizenship or any of those things. We're only looking at what's produced inside the country. So we're going to have to do a bunch of work to look at these other things. But this is the basic definition. All newly produced, final goods and services produced inside the borders of the country in the course of 1 year.